Hi, this is Lenny Pfeffer, President of the Dorchester County Council, and you're tuned in to Mako's Conduit Street Podcast. Whether you're a Maryland resident, a government official, or just someone interested in learning more about public policy in Maryland, this podcast is for you.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Taking over the mic today is your favorite member of the policy team, Dom Butchko. And joining me, we have a very special guest, Jason Stanek with PJM Interconnection. Jason, how you doing?
Thanks, Dom. I'm great to be here. This is a new format for me, but in a new role, although it's an important issue that we'll be discussing today. So happy to share some insight with your membership.
Yeah. So before we dive into energy, which, shocker, that's what we're going to be talking about. Can you tell us a little bit about, who are you? What's your background? How did you end up at PJM? Any life advice for people starting their career? I love to start the shows with something like this.
Yeah, the energy industry has been very good to me, and I suspect that it's a growing industry right now. So for anybody at the beginning of their career, I think there's a lot of runway here. In terms of myself, I've primarily been a utility regulator for the past 25 years, both at the federal and state level. Spent most of my early part of the career at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They are the energy regulator for the wholesale markets. I also worked at the Energy and Commerce Committee on Capitol Hill, Committee of Jurisdiction for drafting energy policy at the federal level. In 2018, Governor Hogan nominated me to be the chair of the Maryland Public Service Commission, where I was for 5 years prior to joining PJM last year.
So you really have the federal state kind of perspective down pat through your whole career. You get what the PSC is going through. You now get what the feds are thinking. You get the whole picture.
I could see
most of it.
There are challenges both at the retail regulatory level, which is the PSC, as well as the wholesale level, which is FERC. So it's a good to sort of step back and see that background.
Well, we've clearly got the right guy for the conversation. So to set the table a little bit on energy, this is a growing issue in Maryland, so much so that counties historically haven't been involved in a lot of energy legislation. And in the past two sessions, we've really been at the table and one of the primary stakeholders. 2025, we saw this was the session of energy. We saw three major bills from the presiding officers. One of them had to do with dispatchable energy. So we had natural gas and nuclear. We had a whole section on solar and another piece of legislation, and then also, setting up the kind of planning infrastructure on where's Maryland going to go into the future. And that's not the only thing. So this summer, for years, people have been saying that Maryland is at risk of blackouts with our currently energy infrastructure and capacity constraints. BGE, for the first time, put out an alert that there might be a blackout. They had one. It was very limited, but that prediction did come to pass. And so this is an issue that is growing. It's an issue that is on the minds of state and local policymakers and deciders. And central to this entire conversation is the PJM interconnection. And so those are three letters where if you're not familiar with the energy space, you might hear them coming up a lot. So just to kind of start out, walk us through, what is the PJM interconnection? What do you do? How are you connected to this big issue?
Right. PJM has quickly become a household name that most people haven't heard of up until probably the past year or so. So the PJM interconnection was created 98 years ago as the grid operator for a number of states. And over the past 100 years, we've expanded our footprint to the point where we now provide the grid services for 13 states plus the District of Columbia. That involves residents of about 67 million customers that we serve. We have the ability to dispatch up to 1,400 generating resources over our 88,000 miles of transmission lines that we operate.
Now, what's the actual, when we say 13 states? So you're like, isn't it Virginia? Do you go up into New York as well?
We stop short in New York. So
Okay.
It's New Jersey as far as our northern point down to North Carolina.
Okay.
And then we go from Delaware all the way out to Chicago.
But Chicago's like a weird island. It's not just like PJM out to Chicago. Chicago's this weird chunk that's just there.
That's right. It's a non-contiguous piece we call it the ComEd service territory So effectively, we serve the city of Chicago and outlying suburbs, and the rest of the state is served by another grid operator.
So I've just seen this map a lot, and I'm personally curious why. Why are you given Chicago and then the other grid operators not?
Well, we have several other non-contiguous pieces, including both in Indiana, where we have a small portion of the state, as well as Michigan. It's the way that they've grown up over the years. The transmission owners get to make that election to be a part of an RTO, which is the grid, or not. And they get to choose effectively. Do we want to be a member of PJM or one of the other 6 large grid operators in the country?
Interesting. So how does that, if we're thinking about the flow of electrons, how does that impact? Like if I have you control facilities in Pennsylvania or Maryland, like facilities that generate electricity, but then I'm in Chicago, but you have to cross potentially like multiple grid operators. How does that play into your calculus?
Yeah, at most we would only cross one other non-contiguous service territory, and we are in constant communications with the other control rooms. For instance, this rest of Illinois is served by the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. We have a direct line from our control room to theirs to ensure that connections across the tie lines are maintained, that the customers are served with whatever energy services they need. So it's very well choreographed and coordinated.
All right. Well, I interrupted you. You stopped, and there was that one question that I've been dying, and I know some of our listeners have. So what else do you have to say on the history, kind of what do you guys do, and how do you like impact Maryland?
Sure. Well, our primary functions are to, number one, operate markets. We have a number of products that we provide for, including energy, capacity, and ancillary services. But a second large core function of PJM is to be the transmission planner, to plan the grid for not only our needs today, but upwards of 20 years from today. And as you are aware, the energy landscape is changing quickly. The demands on the grid, which is a very old piece of machinery, is increasing by the day, largely due to the growth of large customers, particularly data centers.
So we'll put a pin in that because we're going to beat up on Virginia towards the end. So don't worry, we're saving the dessert for last. This is going to be everyone's favorite part. But so let's talk about that infrastructure though, and kind of Maryland's energy needs and infrastructure. Transmission is a big one. So where do you see our biggest kind of soft points are and where we need to grow? And where's your thoughts on all that?
When I testified before the legislature earlier this year, I said the energy outlook in the state of Maryland is dire. And that rang true back in January, and it rings true today. The state operates at a deficit when it comes to energy infrastructure. And I'm talking about both generating the electrons as well as transmitting them. Over the course of the past 20 years, if you take a look at the Public Service Commission's annual reports, you'll see that we have continued to be an increasing importer of electrons produced out of state, to the point where Maryland now imports about 20% of its average daily electricity needs. So where are we getting those electrons? Mostly from our neighbor to the north, Pennsylvania, but it's a network, and electrons travel in the path of least resistance. That's not to say that being a net energy importer is a bad thing. Being a marketplace, similar to a Giant or a Safeway, PJM would have no job if everybody was either an importer or an exporter. So we match the needs. But unlike some states where, depending on the day or the month, they're an importer or an exporter, Maryland for many, many years is just a net energy importer.
Is 20%, is that deficit? What's the standard kind of across PJM or across the country? Where are most states exporters? Is it an equilibrium? Is 20% massive? Is 20% standard? Like, where do we kind of sit in that universe?
We sit as a sort of typically a net energy importer. There are other states that are almost always a net energy exporter. So among them is Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois. They typically are exporting every day. The states that are importing every day include Maryland, District of Columbia, Delaware, and New Jersey. And the remaining states that we have, they're sort of on the margin. So they could be an importer one day, exporter the next.
Okay. And what So a lot of those are small jurisdictions. I mean, Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland, Pennsylvania, or DC, very, very small. Is it because of the footprint?
That could play a role. Obviously, the District of Columbia doesn't have a lot of available land to site a large solar farm, wind turbines, or natural gas plant. So they import almost 100% of their needs. Of course, Washington, D.C. is more of a city as opposed to a state, so the characteristics are a bit different. But Delaware, Maryland, and New Jersey fall into the same sort of category as large net energy importers.
And have we always been a net energy importer, or were we one of those equilibrium states previously?
Well, we're at 40% right now, but if you look back at reports back in 2015 or so, we were in the neighborhood of like 25 to 30%. So we're increasing our reliance on the grid, on PJM, to power the lives of Marylanders.
And so how also does that relate to the transmission? Because, we have the generation, but then we also have kind of the wires to move the electrons. How does that play into it?
So they're complementary. If you seek not to build new generation in your jurisdiction, you could build new transmission lines to import that. You need essentially one or the other. The problem that we're seeing in Maryland is that we're not building generation and we're not building transmission. Either one of those could be a solution on its own. Ideally, if it's better if you have both generation and transmission. But in my former role at the PSC, I could tell you that over the course of 5 years, I was not able to construct 1 inch of new high voltage interstate transmission. And that's for a number of reasons. But we have those challenges in Maryland. They're magnified because we have a base of customers, residential, commercial, industrial customers that have a steady demand for electricity, but we're not in a position to build new wind turbines, solar arrays, natural gas plants, pipelines, or any other infrastructure.
Now, local governments, I think this has been a big gripe in terms of like land use and energy siting. I mean, we're pretty heavily preempted in the state of Maryland. Not saying that there aren't potential holdups at the local level, but where are the major kind of roadblocks, at least from your perspective at PJM? Because a lot of folks turn to you and say, well, why aren't you approving it fast enough? But then the Public Service Commission plays a role, and then there's also federal regulators outside of PJM. So can you give us like a little flavor of the landscape?
Yeah, so the state siting authority, the agency that has the ultimate authority to approve whether or not energy infrastructure projects are developed in Maryland, is the Public Service Commission. They have the authorization under state law to issue something called a CPCN, Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity. So that could be a solar array, that could be a natural gas plant, that could also be these high voltage transmission lines, which are very controversial. And starting in 2018, when the then Court of Appeals, now Supreme Court of Maryland, determined in the case of Washington County versus Perennial Solar that the Public Service Commission has effectively the exclusive authority outside of what we believed the county had authority to regulate. The PSC now has the exclusive authority to grant these CPCNs. But importantly, they have to provide due consideration to the input of the counties in making that determination. And of course, the term due consideration is somewhat vague and up to interpretation by the PSC.
And not without controversy on both sides as well.
That's right.
Interesting. Okay. So we need to generate more. We need to have more infrastructure. Talk to me a little bit about the PJM queue, because the other thing that we kind of hear a lot about is, well, we want to put all these projects on, like we can actually build them. We just can't literally turn them on because of all the issues in the PJM queue. So what is this phantom queue and why does everybody hate it?
So the queue, if you can imagine, is just a line of applicants who would like to develop a generating project. And then we study those applications to ensure that they could safely be connected to the grid. And for most of our history, the applicants were large power plants. So think of a coal plant or a natural gas-fired generating facility. But starting in about 2019, so relatively recently, we saw the number of projects enter our queue on an annual basis double. And then the following year in 2020, it doubled again. So the number of applicants were not only increasing exponentially, but the quality of the projects and applications also changed. Instead of seeing somebody come in and wanting to build a 600 megawatt combined cycle gas plant, we were seeing a higher quantity of much smaller projects. So think solar, think wind. This was obviously the same time COVID was hitting, and the unique number of applicants in the queue increased dramatically, not only for PJM, but for all of the grid operators in the country. And we needed...
So what's the connection there really quick between COVID and more applicants?
Well, it struck at an inopportune time, but policy at the federal level obviously was also changing. We had a change of administrations in 2020. Obviously, the Biden administration was more receptive to clean energy projects, and that had a role to play as well. But we were processing 300, 400 applications a year, and then it started getting up to 800, 1,300 applications. And taking a look at where a project would interconnect with the grid is pretty complex business. So it takes time to review and move these projects successfully through the queue. We saw that there was a problem as early as 2020. We moved very quickly to work with our stakeholders and interested parties to develop a solution. We filed that solution with our regulator, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They approved it in 2022, and we went live with the reformed queue in 2023. The fruits of the reforms are now taking hold, and by next year, we will have eliminated the backlog that everybody's been talking about. One of the critical arguments against PJM was that PJM is effectively throttling the number of clean energy projects that could potentially connect to the grid. I should make a number of points clear. Number one, most of the projects in our queue nowadays are clean or renewable, somewhere north of 97%. Over the past 2 years, 90% of the projects that have successfully left the queue, cleared the queue, have been clean or renewable projects. That's basically what we're left with at this point. But it's also important to recognize that historically, only 10 to 15% of the applications in our queue actually interconnect to the grid. What happens to the rest of the projects? They fail or fall apart for some other reason: lack of financing, supply chain issues, or importantly, where the states and counties are involved, they weren't able to secure the governmental permits to actually build that energy infrastructure. Hence, our historical rate has been relatively low, 10 to 15%. But we're hopeful with the reformed queue, we'll see a much higher success rate of projects that enter service.
Now, do you treat projects of different sizes differently in the queue? So, like, for example, historically, if you're doing natural gas plants and they're like 50 megawatts or whatever, a higher number, but now you're seeing a ton of smaller solar or wind that's 5, 10, maybe even smaller in terms of megawattage. Do you treat those differently? Is it all the same review? How does that work?
Principally, they go through the same review in terms of a checklist. But obviously, a 1,000 megawatt coal plant is different than a bunch of much smaller solar arrays. So what we do now under the reformed queue is that we have a clustering approach. So we're not reviewing an apple and then an orange and then a banana. We will take all the bananas together, review them, push them through. And we've also, it's important to note, we moved from a first come, first serve approach to a first ready, first serve approach. So think of it like at a buffet line at an all-you-could-eat restaurant. If you have somebody who's moving through the line slowly, everybody behind that diner is going to also move just as slow. With the reformed process, we could actually move projects that are stuck in the middle of the queue ahead if there are other projects that are experiencing some delays.
And you said 26, you're expecting the backlog to be cleared?
By next year, the existing backlog will be reduced to zero. And then we could hit the new projects in what we are calling cycle one.
Okay. And then So before the backlog, what was the kind of timeline to get review and approved? And now that you have this reformed process, what's your anticipated kind of how quickly you're going to get people out?
Yeah, at the height of our delays, we were seeing a timetable of 3 to 5 years. Going forward with the efforts that we've implemented, we're guaranteeing a 1 to 2 year turnaround time as opposed to 3 to 5. In addition, we're working with the folks at Google to help us determine whether or not we could implement additional modernizations to make processes that take several months now. Can we potentially reduce that to days or even shorter?
So you like using AI for that?
We're experimenting with AI, but
So you're part of the energy problem.
we are using electrons to perform our work. But with AI, of course, we're going to have a human set of eyes confirm all the information and the outputs before we pull the trigger on anything.
Okay. Very, very interesting. So things are looking pretty sunny come 2026, post 2026. No one should be complaining about the queue anymore.
That is our hope. We've offered a number of solutions. Our regulator has accepted them, and we'll be off to the races as early as spring, April of 2026.
Okay. To move on for a second now, let's kind of talk about Virginia, data centers, the Piedmont project. I think everybody knows about the Piedmont Reliability Project, but some quick background for those who may be hearing this for the first time. It's basically a power cord. It's a transmission line that goes down from Pennsylvania, across Maryland, and into Virginia, impacts 3 counties, Baltimore County, Carroll County, Frederick County, has garnered a ton of controversy, and it's basically being set up to power Virginia data centers. And so what are your thoughts on that, Jason? I'm sure you have a lot.
So, Dom, I'll correct some of the facts here. There has been a misperception that this is viewed as an extension cord from Pennsylvania to Virginia, when in fact, when you take a look at the actual line, the project itself, it runs from a point in Maryland to another point in Maryland. It doesn't cross the state lines. It's 67 miles in length, crossing the 3 counties that you just referenced. It's a high voltage line, about 500 kV in capacity. When you take a look at the existing infrastructure in Maryland, and as I mentioned, we haven't built high voltage lines in decades in this state. We have a few. We don't have any on the eastern shore of that voltage. We have some lines that serve Calvert Cliffs, of course. We have one line that crosses the Panhandle. And there's an existing line that doesn't parallel the route of the Piedmont project, but it runs from Conestone to Doubs in Frederick County. We performed an analysis in recent years that determined without a new line, Marylanders could see reliability concerns in terms of violations and voltage collapse as early as June of 2027. If these projects are not built, this is not bluster or raising an alarm unintentionally, but we could see power outages in our state. Will some of these electrons flow to serve data centers in Virginia? The answer is yes. But I would draw an analogy such as building an interstate line through a community. That line will now carry electrons that the local service roads are currently carrying. So that frees up capacity on the transmission lines in and around Baltimore City, which is an area of deep concern for us. The transmission system in and around Baltimore is relatively weak, relatively devoid of high voltage lines. So having this new Piedmont line in place will go ahead and relieve some of that pressure on existing lines and provide another east-west link. When you step back, we are, at the end of the day, are just operating one large machine, and that machine does not have any state boundaries. I recognize that elected officials at all levels of government care about their own constituency, whether it be a state or a county, and I recognize that. At PJM, we have a larger responsibility to the 13 states collectively. And if you take a look at, I mean, we may be concerned that we're citing transmission to benefit Virginia, but if you speak to folks in Pennsylvania, they're concerned that they are supporting the state of Maryland. So on one hand, you're helping your neighbors, and maybe that's sort of those concerns are less appropriate today or carry less weight. But we are mindful that there are parochial interests and there are public interests, and sometimes the two don't necessarily overlap.
No, I mean that's understandable. You have a bigger kind of view. I mean, I think counties get that all the time because, we tell the state we have a bigger view, the state tells us they have a bigger view. Can you kind of touch on potentially why the route for the Piedmont project was chosen, like why that particular route? Because a lot of controversy has been, and you just kind of touched on this, well, we have somewhat of a similar path, or we might have existing right of way. Why something new and not using right of way or upgrading lines that are already there?
No, that's a great question. And just to be clear, PJM is not developing the line. The party who's developing the line is PSEG, Public Service Electric and Gas Company.
So send your hate mail to PSEG.
I didn't say that, but we'll answer those questions as well. But in terms of the line siting and the route chosen, PSEG looked at many potential line selections. I believe they whittled it down to about 10 before they selected a particular line route that they filed with the Public Service Commission. Considerations that they look at is on the right of way is effects on communities, effects on landowners, effects on the environment, feasibility. Can they use existing right of way? Are there transmission assets, maybe assets owned by other entities such as Baltimore Gas and Electric, that have available hangars on the transmission towers that they could potentially use? And over the course of this 67-mile project, some of it is on existing right of way, and some of it is on greenfield property, which is property that does not currently host any transmission projects. In this case, PSEG was able to determine a proposed line route that touched somewhere south of 400 unique properties. And if you come to think of that, 67 miles and only touching 400 or less properties is impressive in some respects. But for those landowners whose properties will be affected, we recognize that it's a challenge. It's a concern. If I was a landowner, I would be asking the question, is it needed? Why did you choose my property as opposed to a property a quarter mile to the north or to the south? How will I be compensated? So those concerns are all legitimate. And the developer PSEG is working to the best of their ability with those landowners. But as we've seen in the press, it's been rather contentious lately.
Yeah. And so to use this to transition, talk about contentious, what is PJM's kind of role and also relationship with state government in Annapolis? Piedmont hasn't been without its controversy. The Q has not been without its controversy. But can you give us like a high level, how do you interact? How do you collaborate? How do you potentially have preemption authority over the state if that exists? What does that look like?
Right. We do our best to communicate early and often with all of the stakeholders. That includes county officials, that includes the governor's office, key legislators whose districts the line may be crossing. PJM sent executives to meet with the Carroll County commissioners. We've met with concerned state legislators and the governor's office to let them know what this project is, why it's needed, what PJM's role is as the transmission planner, and what PSEG's role is as the transmission owner and developer of the project. And we continue to do that as the process moves forward. Unfortunately, you may have heard there's been some litigation involved between the project developer as well as some of the landowners along the right of way. County officials have gotten involved. Some federal officials, Congress people have voiced their positions as well. But now it's before the PSC. Just last week, the Public Service Commission issued a procedural schedule which sets out all the milestones from now until the time when it issues a determination. And that determination could be accept the proposal, reject the proposal, or modify the proposal in some way. But it's becoming clear that the commission likely will not issue a ruling until mid-2027.
And again, taking a step back, so how often do you coordinate with the state, and how often are you speaking with the Public Service Commission or potentially the governor's office? Just like generally, what does that PJM Annapolis relationship kind of look like day to day?
Yeah, day to day, it's regular depending on the project. It could be weekly, it could be monthly. We're relatively active during the legislative session. We typically don't testify in support or opposition to bills, but
just the standard letter of information.
We provide information both formally and informally to legislators who would like to know our position. PJM is nonpartisan. We're a nonprofit. We don't have any shareholders. We don't have any share price. So that makes us very unique amongst utilities. At the end of the day, we are fact-based, and we try to provide the facts in an increasingly political environment. And if you take a look at our 13 states plus the District of Columbia, 7 of those jurisdictions are politically blue, and 7 of them are politically red. So it's important for us to maintain our neutrality, our independence, not only independence politically, but independence fuel-wise. We don't prefer coal or gas over solar and wind. And obviously, in a political climate where the clean energy projects are under attack, we're mindful that we need electrons, and we will take them from wherever they're produced, whether it be an offshore wind turbine or a combined cycle natural gas plant.
So one closing question for you, Jason. Of the 13 states in the PJM, which is your favorite, and why is it Maryland?
My favorite is Maryland. I've been a resident here now for a quarter century, but Maryland also is a very challenged state in the PJM mix. By volume, Maryland represents about 6% of the demand of PJM. But based on some of the sort of inherent characteristics that we just discussed, if we are to attract new businesses in our state, if we want data centers, the pros and the cons associated with data centers, we need to further strengthen our transmission system, make it more robust. As we noted, hosting any type of energy infrastructure, sewage infrastructure, telecom, electric, new highways is always controversial for those who are going to be directly and personally affected. We recognize that, but the state is entering a really critical period where we may not be able to keep the lights on in 2027 at this rate. And that I don't say that I say that recognizing that is a pretty charged statement, right? We're in a first world country in a state that ranks number 1 in terms of affluence. Can we keep the lights on going forward in a matter of just a year or two? That's an open question, but I was really heartened to see that the legislature in this session made energy their top priority. I suspect that it will need to be amongst the top priorities in the coming years as well.
Well, that is quite the happy note to end on. Jason, thank you for coming on. I think this was very informative and certainly expect an invitation for the future. Couple of things kind of before we hop off and people tune out. MACo's winter conference is coming up in December 10th through the 12th at the Hyatt in Cambridge. Registration will be open, so please, biggest conference right before the start of session. Thank you again, Jason, and thank you to the listeners who stayed on this long. This is Dom signing off.